Thank you, Brenda. Beautiful. Well, as I was preparing for the month of February, I realized that there were two auspicious dates this coming week that I had to choose from for talk topics. One is Charles Darwin's birthday, which is Thursday, and the other, of course, is Valentine's Day. And so I had to figure out which one to go first, and I flipped a coin. And guess which one came up first? Valentine's Day. So that's the topic for today, is love enough? And of course, as we acknowledge Valentine's Day, I always like to set aside a little time to recognize the true meaning of the day, the true star of Valentine's Day, which we all know is chocolate. You got it. Someone said almonds, but you know, you can have almonds with your chocolate. But yes, chocolate. And I'm a minister, right? So part of my job here is to spread the good news. That's what the word gospel means, right? Good news. So I'm here to spread the good news that chocolate is health food, at least dark chocolate, they're telling us. This is not superstitious, pseudoscientific, wishful thinking either. This is the real deal. Here are 5 scientifically verified health benefits of dark chocolate. Number 1, lowers the blood pressure. Okay, that's a good thing. Next, it lowers LDL, the bad cholesterol. I always wonder, you know, back when they talk about good and bad cholesterol, how would I remember which one is which? LD leaves you dead. That's the bad cholesterol. That's how I make it stick in my head anyway. Number 3, it is a potent antioxidant, and antioxidants gobble up free radicals, which are destructive molecules that are implicated in a whole bunch of different ailments and diseases. Number 4, it contains serotonin, a natural mood-boosting antidepressant. And number 5, along the same lines, when you eat it, it releases pleasure-inducing endorphins, which is a highfalutin way of saying that it makes you feel good. Those last 2 are just a technical way of saying it makes you feel good. And of course, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to know that eating dark chocolate makes you feel good. And I've thought often that if somebody could figure out a way to take dark chocolate and turn it into a religious sacrament, you know, like the way the Rastafarians do down in Jamaica with marijuana, they'd be lined up out the door and onto the street to get into something like that. So there's something to think about. And of course, the other thing we need to remember is this next slide here. This is important. Chocolate comes from cocoa, which comes from a tree. That makes it a plant. Therefore, chocolate counts as salad. You're welcome. You're welcome. And just one more thing. That same flawless logic applies to coffee as well. Coffee is a bean. It comes from a tree or a bush, which means that coffee is also a salad. This is a win-win situation for me. Dark chocolate and coffee. That's about all I need. Okay, so we really do have to move on to our real topic for today, which is love. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, that the English language is totally and completely inadequate when it comes to the concept of love, because all we have is this one little 4-letter word that gets used in all sorts of different ways that are contradictory and confusing. And one of the best ways to see this, very simply, is to look at the lyrics of different love songs, because you don't have to go very far before you come up with some really good, or maybe I should say bad, examples of how we abuse the word love in our language. There's a song you all know called When a Man Loves a Woman by Percy Sledge, right? So listen to this lyric. When a man loves a woman, deep down in his soul, she can bring him such misery. If she plays him for a fool, he's the last one to know. Love and eyes can't ever see. They say love is blind, right? That doesn't sound like a very good thing. All right? And it gets worse. Elvis Presley, famous for a song called Love Me. And here we come up with the fool theme again. Seems to run in love songs. Treat me like a fool. Treat me mean and cruel. But love me. Wring my faithful heart. Tear it all apart. But love me. All of these songs about the power of love to turn people into codependent, dysfunctional doormats. That's what it amounts to. So I think I've proved my case, have I not? That at least when it comes to our love songs and different things in our culture, we get mixed messages and we end up trivializing something that we claim to take very seriously. The thing that we claim to be so important to us gets trivialized in our mass culture just because we really don't have adequate words to really say what we mean sometimes. And I find it interesting that this is happening in a country where we have this increasingly vocal group of people who insist that the United States is a Christian nation, as they go about demonizing and marginalizing anyone who doesn't conform to their version or vision of religion. Christians in a Christian nation who apparently haven't read what Jesus had to say about love. They seem to have forgotten about that part in the Gospels where Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And for Jesus, this love was unconditional, all-inclusive, and absolutely no strings attached. Nobody gets marginalized. Nobody gets demonized. None of this baloney about love the sinner but hate the sin. That doesn't cut it. So the best known story that illustrates what Jesus is talking about when he says to love our neighbor comes from the Gospel of Luke, and it's the story of this scribe who tries to trip Jesus up a little bit. Jesus just gets done saying the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so the scribe says, okay, smart guy, just tell me this. Just exactly who is my neighbor? This is where Jesus launches into the story of the Good Samaritan, which we're all familiar with. We've heard this time and time again. It's the story of a guy who's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho along this dangerous road where he is robbed, he's beaten, and he's left for dead. The first two people who happen upon him and find him here in this sorry state were high-ranking officials in the Jewish religious hierarchy. There was a priest who came along and a Levite who came along. And they saw him all beaten and bloody. And what do? They cross over to the other side of the road so they wouldn't have to look at him or hear him moaning there in the ditch, and they continued merrily and contentedly on their way. Now, one interpretation of this part of the story is that these religious muckety-mucks were forbidden by Jewish law to touch someone who was bleeding, lest they become unclean. Which is just another way of saying that they were too spiritual to be of any earthly good. Jesus was using this part of the story as a not-so-subtle condemnation of hidebound, dogmatic religion that actually doesn't serve human needs, but actually stands in the way of human decency and compassion. That's what we see happening here. Their religion prevented them from doing the decent thing. So the next person who comes along is, of course, the Good Samaritan, a Samaritan. You know, I used to hear this story in church on Sunday at least once a year when I was growing up. Nobody ever bothered to explain to me exactly what a Samaritan was. And it's really the key to this entire story. Samaritans were Jewish people who had been left behind when the Babylonians captured everyone else and hauled them off into slavery in Babylonia. They took the cream of the crop, and the rest of them they left behind. And the ones who were left behind, they intermarried with people from the surrounding tribes. And when the Babylonian exile ended a whole generation later and all those people came back to their homeland. The Samaritans, the people who were left behind living in the land of Samaria, Samaritans who had intermarried, were regarded as traitors, impure. They were despised, and that's the way it went from there on forward. Now, flash forward to Nazi Germany. They would have called the Samaritans a mongrel race. That's the terminology from Nazi Germany. The question for today is, who are the Samaritans in our time? Who are people that are dehumanized in our culture, marginalized, called deviant, illegal, deportable, things like that? Could you think of anyone? It's not too difficult, is it? Unfortunately. So in this story, it's the person who is deemed inferior, subhuman, mongrel, the Samaritan who is actually the hero in the story, who exhibits the love and the compassion that Jesus approves of and that he's trying to get across in his parables and other stories. The pure and upstanding Jewish religious figures are useless. The Samaritan saves the day. He provides first aid. He takes the injured man to an inn. He pays the innkeeper out of his own pocket and then tells the innkeeper, I'll be back on my return trip to pay you for any additional expenses that this guy may ring up while he's recovering with you. He goes way above and beyond what anyone would expect, and especially would expect in those days of a Samaritan, because their expectations were that these were bad people, they couldn't do anything right. And this is the example that Jesus uses to illustrate what it means to love one's neighbor and to tell us just exactly who is our neighbor. So we get back to the word love, the word that Jesus used in this story, and Jesus had it a little bit better than we do, because he didn't, of course, obviously he didn't speak English. Probably spoke Aramaic, and Aramaic is a very colorful and nuanced language, and the word that Jesus used for love got interpreted into Greek, which is the language of the Bible. And the word that Jesus used for love that gets translated into Greek, we've talked about before, is this one up here. Agapao. It's a verb, not a noun. Verbs connote action. And when you look into the root of this word, it's beyond just fondness and sentiment and that kind of thing. I mean, that's all well and good, but it goes way beyond that. It's about the deliberate assent of the will as a matter of principle, duty, and propriety. And I underlined and bolded and highlighted the word principle because I believe that what Jesus is getting at in this story of the Good Samaritan is really talking about our second unity principle. His definition of love is bound up in our second unity principle, which goes like this. You're probably familiar with it. Human beings have a spark of divinity within them, the Christ Spirit within. They're very essences of God, and therefore they are also inherently good. If that's the way we are, then that's the way our neighbor is. When we love our neighbor as ourself, we're focusing on that essential divinity instead of focusing on the errors and faults which we all have. So I think at this point, we've probably just answered the question of the day, is love enough? And the answer, of course, is yes, but not the way we use and abuse the word today. We have to reframe it. We have to take it deeper. And here's a way that we might be able to put this into practical terms. There's a book that's been around for a little while now called Yes, You Can Change the World by Aman Motwane. And I think the whole book is really about our second unity principle. And he states our second unity principle this way. He says to see the intrinsic worth of every person you encounter and he gives 3 practical suggestions for how we might go about doing that. So we're going to use Valentine's Day. Really, we should be doing this every day, but when we have something to focus on, we use Valentine's Day kind of as a launching pad, maybe to begin to incorporate these 3 practices into our daily life. And so the first practice he gives us is to focus not on how little time you have, but on how to make the most of what little time you have with every person. Right? Because the question is, how am I supposed to see the intrinsic worth of every person I encounter when we have such fleeting and brief encounters with people? Think about it. Our lives move along so quickly, we bump into people all the time. How can we do that? Well, the key is to not focus on how little time we have, but to make sure that we're making the most of that time that we have with each person. You know, we're never going to have enough time for all of the things we think that we need to accomplish, and often our personal relationships suffer because of that. We just kind of go through them mindlessly, unconsciously. So, yes, the actual physical time with our encounters may be brief, it may be short, but instead of seeing it as a negative, we realize that even though the time is short, that's what makes it so much more important, so much more precious, because the moments are fleeting. It's really a good way to look at life too, right? It's precious and it's stunningly short sometimes. So we want to stay focused. And when it comes to other people, we want to focus our entire attention on the person that we are relating to, the person who is in front of us in this very moment, and regard them as the most important person in the universe. Even for a few seconds. At home, at the grocery store, everyone counts, everyone matters, everyone is our neighbor. The second suggestion he gives us is to focus not on what you see on the outside of the person, but on the person within. Well, how are we supposed to do that? I thought only Superman had X-ray vision. Well, again, the answer is really tied up in what Jesus was talking about. Love your neighbor as yourself means that we see our neighbor as we see ourselves. We know what each of us goes through, and it's a pretty good bet that everyone else goes through the same stuff, negative or positive. If we want to know what's going on with another person, take a few moments to reflect on the things that we each experience. No matter how we may appear on the outside, there's often something opposite happening on the inside. Anger on the outside. That could be due to fear or even pain on the inside. We all know what that's like. We all know this about ourselves, so we can also know it about our neighbor. When we talk about seeing the spark of divinity, it means that we humanize the other person. Isn't that kind of a paradox? To see the divinity, we have to humanize them. My belief really is that the depth of our divinity is coextensive with the fullness of our own humanity. And the better that we get to know that in ourselves, the better we're going to be able to see it and appreciate it in other people. And his third suggestion, focus not on what's wrong with a person, but what makes them right. Be willing to see their strength in the midst of perceived weakness. One of the things we strive to do here is to focus on our strengths. And we need to remember that often the only reason that some trait in a person is viewed as a weakness is simply because of the label that we choose to put on it. Is that person really stubborn? Or are they tenacious? A little difference in quality there, isn't there? Are they scattered, airheads, or are they creative? Are they visionary? Is someone cold, or are they just being objective? Is that their nature? The words we use have consequences, and we need to be cautious because people have a way of living up or down to our expectations. You ever notice that? It's one of the criticisms of IQ testing. Children take an IQ test and then they get a label sometimes. They're labeled as bright or they're labeled as slow. If the child is labeled as slow, they tend to be shielded from classes or programs that we don't expect them to understand, when the reality is that they might be perfectly capable of mastering a skill that we would deny them due to our expectations. They never get the opportunity, and what they are finding is that when given the opportunity, when we raise our expectations, people, children, everyone tends to step up another level to the challenge. So the message here is to always expect the best, and to use that to refine and expand our definition of love. So Valentine's Day is a good reminder. It's a great starting point. It's something we need to do every day, and I think it's also a great example of how we can exercise a degree of control over the way that we evolve, especially at the level of our thinking. By expanding and reframing the word love, we are actually participating in our own evolution to expand our circles of caring and compassion, which is one of the most important elements of the evolution of consciousness, to expand our circles of caring and compassion. And as I mentioned at the start of the service, since this Thursday marks the birth date of Charles Darwin, we are going to talk more about that kind of evolution next Sunday. So hope to see you then. Thank you.